So I'm not sure who Irene here is. I think she's like a college student, but the reason I'm bringing up her tweet is that it exemplifies what I have seen over and over and over again with people who are either willfully or just ignorantly misinterpreting what is meant by Donald Trump banning critical race theory, first from federal government agencies and now extending that ban to federal contractors. And of course, I don't really blame Irene for this. I don't even blame her teachers that are feeding her these ideas. I blame the media first and foremost because they are willfully. I can understand how people might, like Irene, might completely misunderstand what has been banned when it comes to critical race theory. I totally get it, and we're going to talk about that. But the media has no excuse. This is literally the media's job to report on things accurately, and they are not doing it. So let's start by reading what Irene had to say in this thread of tweets. My social work professor was telling me about this, and I'm surprised it's not all over my timeline. Universities are reeling to understand this executive order because, as it stands, it bans any federally funded entity from essentially teaching about white supremacy and racism in the U.S., and she is citing a tweet that's sent out by Chris Rufo with his, kind of victorious, like, it is banned by Trump in the federal government, the military, and all federal contractors. It was a glorious day when Trump did that. But Irene here is trying to say that this just bans teaching about white supremacy and racism in the U.S., and that is patently not true. It is not true at all. It bans a really specific subset of a fringe ideology. That is what it bans, but you can still teach about white supremacy as it is correctly defined and racism in the United States. But she keeps going. She says she's not sure if the class she teaches, Fundamentals of Social Justice, will be allowed to teach about white privilege, institutions of racism, etc. in this country. Is that not terrifying? No, I actually think that sounds pretty effing great. The executive order requires that diversity efforts be approved by the government. Funding for research grants will be affected, coupled with the new Commission on Patriotic Education. And listen, Irene doesn't understand what she's talking about. She doesn't. And so what I want to do in this video is I just really want to do a bare bones, what is critical race theory? What is actually being banned in these executive orders? Because this is really important to understand. There are all sorts of things that you can teach that have nothing to do with critical race theory. Critical race theory, in my education at least, because I'm old and I went to school like a while ago, this was not taught in schools. And I learned about racism. I learned about white supremacy. I studied the Civil War extensively. I studied early American history extensively. It wasn't inundated with this nonsense, though, when I happened to be in school. Thank you, God. But such as it is right now, this fringe ideology, this fringe school of thought that has come out of like the least academically rigorous area in the academy, these gender studies departments, has become inundated. It's become ingrained into every course of study in most colleges and universities. So it is important to understand exactly what we are referencing when we say critical race theory. And for that, I'm first going to turn to this definition on New Discourses, which is like the Bible, the Mecca of all things social justice crazy. And we're just going to look at what James Lindsay has to say about what the definition of critical race theory actually is. As can be observed in the examples above and below, and I'll link to this. I'm not going to read this full page, but I'll link to this so you can go and check it out for yourself. Critical race theory begins with a cynical view that race is the predominant structural element of America and other societies, and that all analysis of race must incorporate systemic power, which is to say systemic racism. This, it insists, is everywhere, ordinary, permanent, and mostly and badly hidden. A kind of racism that is just beneath the surface. So see also code, mask, internalized dominance, internalized oppression, and internalized racism. One duty of the critical race theorist is to expose this hidden racism wherever it can be found. And folks, if you start looking for racism absolutely everywhere, trust me, you will find it absolutely everywhere. You know what's funny? I actually just tweeted this out. I was looking this morning. Someone was nice enough to send me diversity training from JP Morgan Chase. So yeah, I have all those documents. There's honestly nothing really all that exciting and different in them. But there's this one slide that I just want to bring your awareness to in the course of this discussion, where it says, here's the spectrum of inclusive change agents. And apparently the ideal inclusive change agent is a fighter. How are they defining a fighter? Always on the lookout for prejudice and sees it everywhere. That is literally what JP Morgan Chase is defining as the ideal of what they want in their work environment. Someone that sees prejudice everywhere. Now, folks, let's back up. Like, if you want to dislike someone, if you want a reason to dislike someone, let's just separate this out from critical race theory for a second. If you want a reason to dislike someone, you can always find a reason to dislike someone. I see this happening in workplaces all the time, where someone has just they've rubbed you the wrong way, and nothing that this person can do for you is going to be correct after they've rubbed you the wrong way. You will actively look for reasons to dislike them. Like, if they look at you a certain way, like, who do they think they are giving me the stink eye? Or who do they think they are eating a tuna fish sandwich for lunch? Or any of these things, you will find reasons to dislike people. In the same way that you can do that, you can always find reasons to call someone a racist. Always. In fact, I had Helen Pluckrose on my channel a couple months ago, and I said to her, I was like, Helen, how would, and I literally made this scenario up on the spot. I said, if I was just walking down the street wearing an orange t-shirt, how would I be a racist? And she said, oh, Carlin, that's easy, because the orange t-shirt that you're wearing is reflective of an orange prison jumpsuit, and how dare you think that it's okay to wear that orange t-shirt walking down the street? And she's absolutely right. She wanted to find something that was racist about it, and she found something that was racist about it, because we can always do that if we are always on the lookout for things that we think are racist, particularly if we're in college and we have been assigned by a faculty member to write a paper about systemic racism. You can find it literally anywhere. Let's keep going. Critical race theory begins with observations such as that racism is ubiquitous in American society, and thus all interactions across racial differences must account for the influences of structural racism. All people within these systems must be aware of and engage their position relative to the theorized racial power dynamics intentionally and at all times. As such, critical race theory advocates increasing the social significance of racial categories in order to engage in identity politics. Critical race theory stands apart from other kinds of theory in that it is usually written quite clearly and has simple tenets. These include the central theme that racism is ordinary and permeates everything. And this is why when you read books like White Fragility, they literally say, all white people are racist. All white people are racist simply by virtue of being white. There is no other way to interpret it. That is the only possible interpretation based on how they are defining things, the definitions that they are making up, which do not align with the standard definitions that most people use. One consequence of this view is that critical race theory explicitly endorses historical revisionism, as it proceeds from the assumption that history was written by the dominant white people who have, as a result of their privilege and its influences, not represented it accurately. And I gotta tell you guys, just side note, I'm concerned about how history is going to be written about this time period, because oftentimes it is written by people in the universities or people in the media, and I think that they're absolutely not interpreting correctly what is going on in this time period. So it's going to be very interesting to see 20, 30, 50 years from now, God willing, I'm still alive, to see how the history books are actually written about this time period. So this is basically the underlying premise of critical race theory. This is what you need to know. This is, if you take nothing away from this video, we are talking about critical race theory when it starts with this cynical view that race is the predominant structural element of American and other societies, and that all analysis of race must incorporate systemic power, which is to say systemic racism. That's what we're talking about. Race is the primary thing that we are concerned about all the time, and everyone everywhere is racist, especially white people. Okay, so now let's look at this executive order. This is the executive order. This is Trump's second executive order that he issued about a week ago on September 22nd. And this is where he extended his initial ban on critical race theory in the government, which at first only applied to federal agencies. He extended it out to federal contractors. Now, this section right here is specifically defining what is meant by critical race theory. This is the White House executive order, the definition of what is not allowed for federal government contractors. During the performance of this contract, the contractor agrees as follows. The contractor shall not use any workplace training that inculcates in its employees any form of race or sex stereotyping or any form of race or sex scapegoating, including the concepts that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. So you can't teach someone that one, like a race or sex, is better than another. You can't teach that according to the executive order. 2, an individual, by virtue of his race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. This second point right here, this gets at the crux of what critical race theory is, because when critical race theory teaches that all white people are inherently racist, or all men are inherently misogynist, or what have you, that is what this is getting at. You are no longer allowed to teach these premises in training that if you have federal government contracts, you're not allowed to do it. 3, an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his race or sex. So this is actually a really good thing. You are not allowed to teach that individuals should be discriminated against on the basis of their race or sex. There was a time when we all agreed to this. There was a time when we were all in agreement about this. And now places like California right now is literally trying to rescind their civil rights laws so that they can discriminate on the basis of race or sex. This is actually going on in the United States of America. In California, they're going to vote on it next month, man. Like, it is very, very likely that California will become a place where where people are allowed to discriminate against other people on the basis of race or sex, but not if you want those sweet, sweet, sweet federal contracts. D, members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. So this is essentially one of the premises that critical race theory really attacks, is this idea that people can be colorblind. Now, they've changed the definition of colorblindness, though, because how most people define when they say I'm colorblind, what they mean is that I'm not going to treat you differently because your skin color is different than mine. That's usually what most people mean. What critical race theory has done has attempted to redefine the definition of colorblindness so that it means I don't see that you're a different race than me. Well, if you're black and you're standing in front of me, I'm going to see you're black, obviously. I don't even like using the word colorblind specifically because I think it can get very confusing to people. But essentially what this is saying is that if you want federal government contracts, you cannot convince people that they should try to treat people differently based on the color of their skin, which is exactly what critical race theory teaches. In fact, many times when critical race theory is implemented in trainings in organizations, they literally segregate the training. They have one training for white folks and they have one training for everyone who is not white. That is inherently treating someone differently on the basis of their race. No longer allowed. E, an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. You're not allowed to teach that. F, an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of his race or sex. So what this is essentially saying, so one of the things that they talk about is systemic racism when they're making that argument, essentially saying that like all white people today are responsible for the sins of the white people that owned slaves back in the day. You are no longer allowed to teach that in the federal government. That is a good thing because guess what, folks? There ain't a single white person in America today who owned slaves. Doesn't exist. Now, Could we still have conversations about the impacts of slavery and the long-term implications, especially on Black communities? Sure, we can have those conversations, but I think we need to start with a baseline understanding that white people today are not responsible for slavery. Particularly, and I'm going to take particular issue with this because, dude, I'm French. Okay, I'm French and I'm Irish. There is no slavery ownership in my entire ancestral history. And yeah, I have it plotted back to before they came to the New World, man. So no, I do not take any responsibility for white people in the South owning slaves in the 17 and 1800s. Any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. And frankly, the fact that they have to enumerate that someone should not feel guilty because they were born white or because they were born male, because that's what this is referring to. I mean, how crazy has it gotten that we literally have to say to federal government contractors, you are not allowed to teach your white staff members that they should experience white guilt. Because what happens in these trainings is the white staff members, and this is very well documented, what they actually have to do is go and write these big letters of apology for all the racist acts they have committed by virtue of being white. They actually have to do this. They have to apologize for being white. This is ingraining white guilt onto people purely because they were born white. And the same is true for if we're talking about gender, the same is true for making men feel guilty because they were born male and the women they work with were born female. This makes absolutely no sense. And frankly, if you teach this crap in organizations, this directly inhibits teamwork. This does not enhance teamwork where people feel guilty because of things that they can't control. It hurts teamwork. It hurts collaboration. And I don't want my tax dollars being spent on companies that are not using their resources effectively. And that is exactly what's happening when you're implementing these critical race theory trainings. Meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist, sexist, or were created by a particular race to oppress another race. So what this is saying, and there have literally been documents in the Smithsonian that say this, is that you cannot teach that hard work is a concept of white supremacy. That is literally one of the teachings of critical race theory, that only white people, or that white people defined hard work, and that people of color cannot possibly be expected to adhere to the white ideal of what hard work means. I'm sorry, what? What? That is first of all, that is an incredibly racist statement. It is incredibly racist to say that people, because of the color of their skin, can't be expected to work hard or show up on time or do quality work or write freaking memos. And I'm not making this stuff up, guys. This is literally what this training says. I mean, that is incredibly racist. And that, I'm not even saying racist against white people. That is incredibly racist against anyone who is not white if you think that they can't show up and work hard and do a good job, and that's only a concept of the white supremacy. Are you kidding me? The term race or sex stereotyping means ascribing character traits, values, morals, and ethical codes, privileges, statuses, or beliefs to a race or sex, or to an individual because of his or her race or sex. And the term race or sex scapegoating means assigning fault, blame, or bias to a race or sex, or to members of that race or sex because of their race or sex. So this is what has been banned in the federal government. This is what has been banned. Now, that does not mean that there are not certain types of diversity trainings you can do. There are still diversity trainings you can do out there that are not based on critical race theory. Those absolutely exist. There are also all sorts of training programs that you can do around helping enhance communication, in helping increase individual empowerment, helping teams better collaborate, work well together, developing group cohesion. You can do all those things without it being based on critical race theory. Critical race theory is an extraordinarily small fringe subset of the types of trainings that organizations can do. That is just the way it is. It is not, up until very, 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 very recently, and I'm talking probably since George Floyd's death, This was not the primary type of training that existed in organizations. It was not. Was it done? Absolutely. It's been done for a really long time. But there were all sorts of other trainings that were going on that had absolutely nothing to do with critical race theory. And now what has happened is that critical race theory has taken over the training industry. This is why these days, guys, I'm focusing much more of my time and energy on YouTube, because I'm not shilling for this nonsense. I will not do it under any circumstances. This is harmful to individuals. It is harmful to teams. It is harmful to organizations. We should not be spending our tax dollars on it, and it was absolutely appropriate for the president to ban it, not only in federal agencies, but in anywhere that is getting our taxpayer dollars. It is not going to create an effective use of that money, and organizations would be much better off doing different types of trainings. Now, will this affect colleges and universities? Yeah, you bet it will. That the new executive order, and I didn't actually really fully understand this when I initially talked about this new executive order, but if you're looking at the way the way grants are issued from the federal government to colleges and universities, oh, this is going to have some impact, man. And I've said this before, and I stand by this. I think if Donald Trump gets reelected, he's going to go more directly after colleges and universities on this issue. So, you know what? Irene's right. Her Intro to Social Justice professor may no longer be able to teach Intro to Social Justice, at least not in its current form, based on this absurd ideology that should not be given any credence in our society. I'm sorry, just shouldn't. It shouldn't. And I don't know why we disagree on this. I actually don't think most people disagree on this. I think that there is a very, very few people who actually understand the definition of what we are talking about. And that is the problem. People don't understand what this is because the media lies to them and tells them it is something that it is not. So if you don't do training based on critical race theory, you got nothing to worry about. There are lots of great training programs that exist. There are lots of great diversity and inclusion programs that are not based on this nonsense. Go find one of those, man. Really not that hard, and it's going to be a much better use of your money. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, sharing it out, giving it a thumbs up, leaving a comment. Just feed that algorithm, baby. That's all I got for right now. I'll see you soon.